The year was 1967. The streets ran rampant with anti-war protests. The American people had been put in a precarious situation in which they had to choose between what was right for America and what was good for America. Most of the United States population at this point, actually half, was under the age of 25, just old enough to have an opinion that actually mattered some. But this story isn't really about that cultural revolution in particular. In fact, the story is not about the war at all. This is a story about a young, naive couple from the suburbs of Marin County. They desired greatly to be something they were not. They got what they wanted, in a way. The two young lovers, Sherry of 19, George of 20, tall, brunette, experimenting with a new short-styled cut, sat shotgun in George Sherman's brand spanking new Plymouth Barracuda. This car looked just like him, a shiny, pristine white exterior with brown leather seats to accent that said exterior. George and Sherry were nothing special. He was finishing up his last year at the University of California, and unlike most college graduates at the time, he wanted, more than anything, to be a writer. Sherry had big plans to go to a technical school in the city and learn typing so she could be a secretary. In other words, their dreams did not exactly break boundaries. Anyway, as they drew up the fabled and very much accurate steep hills of San Francisco, you could hear the conversation of the lovebirds over the sound of Light My Fire by the Doors playing on the radio. To an outsider, it may have seemed like the two were fighting, when in actuality they enjoyed a good intellectual tussle with one another about current events, whether it be politics or the new age of hippies. Tonight, it was the latter. The hippies were the one big question mark that had to do with the couple's big move into the city. Were they going to have to succumb to this new and strange lifestyle? Neither of them was ever very comfortable with who they were, never really having a label as a jock or a prep. They always flew under the radar, but hippie was a new sort of label. More than just a title, it was a lifestyle, a set of beliefs. It had become revolutionary. For research purposes that Sherry did not understand, George wanted to delve into this new lifestyle that was on the rise. After all, there was no better place for it. Sherry was more than skeptical. All the drugs and music and people scared her little vulnerable character. Yet the two carried on, and their faith in each other was tested in a more unusual way than expected. The 1967 Plymouth Barracuda barreled down the hill of Haight Street onto the corner of Ashbury. Luminous signs promoting a promiscuous nightlife glowed and welcomed the youngins into their new neighborhood. One sign in particular caught George's eye. It was lit up in bright fluorescent letters and read Psychic. George slightly nudged Sherry and pointed at the sign. Sherry replied with a not-so-enthused, George replied with a little more persistence. Sherry did indeed. George was her dream man, and she would love a confirmation that she was also his dream woman. Reluctantly, the two stepped back into the psychic shop. Immediately, their vision was blurred by a thick cloud of smoke that smelled of incense and patchouli. Sherry let out a few loud coughs, tugging on George's arm a little. Gypsy music echoed through their ears, and they were naturally guided to the back of the shop, in which a tiny woman sat awaiting their arrival. She was shriveled and as old as time. A panic look surfaced upon Sherry's face. George smiled uncomfortably and pulled Sherry closer to him. He looked into her eyes trustingly. They then sunk into the plush red seats that had suddenly appeared below them. Onto a table covered in beautiful shawls, Madame Segedy laid down a set of fresh tarot cards. George had never remembered telling Madame his name, Yet he continued on, laying all of his thoughts onto the table. A crash of thunder. The first card is laid down on the table. It is the face of two lovers. Another crash. The second card is down. A reversed fool. A crescendo. The final card is laid out. The hanged man. Quicker than a cheetah, Sherry ran out of the darkened, incense-filled establishment. She was in tears when George found her, sitting on the curb, face in her hands. Immediately, George regretted his decision to ever take Sherry to the psychic in the first place. He knew Sherry did not believe it, but weirdly enough, George knew what Madame Segedy had said was right. If the end was near, he would have to make the best of his time that he had left on this earth. The next 6 months of Sherry and George's life was relatively normal. They were deeply in love and they did everything together. Every day, George wrote for 5, maybe 6 hours straight. Sherry was perfect to him. She was his muse. Even though Sherry was reluctant at first to delve into the lifestyle of the locals, she found a perfect medium. On the weekdays, she would be a part of the office, typing and receiving calls. She made quick friends. It was the summer of love, after all, so psychedelics had just been introduced by a local hero of sorts, Timothy Leary. And after one late night of psychedelic-induced partying by George's command, Sherry and George began their late-night trek across town with some randos they had just met. They had no money, no car, no map. They were forced to navigate the city alone. This would be the beginning of the end. After about 10 minutes, the randos peeled off to be on their own. The wind blew with an aggressive vengeance that night. George felt it, even in his drug-addled state. This would be his last night on Earth, and if he could do anything about it, it would not be Sherry's last night. Somehow, the two had wandered off into one of the darker, less residential parts of the city. Streetlights flickered, some powered off, others lit up just enough to see 5 feet in front of you. Somewhere, not too far away, George had heard the breathing of a stranger. The breaths were heavy and far between. Flash. George had been hit square in the head by some heavy object. He looked around frantically to look for Sherry. Another loud thwack, and Sherry was down too, out cold. The assailant now revealed himself, out from the shadows. He was of average height, but was heavy-set. Over his face and chest he wore a mask of black over a heavy parka. Through the dark screen of fabric, George could see his eyes. They were dark and murderous, covered with cheap, thick framed glasses. Sherry was coming to again. The assailant approached her, and George yelled out. The dark assailant became the true form of evil, cocking his head towards George, eyeing him maliciously. George responded desperately. Blandly, coldly, the soon-to-be killer uttered, Sherry looked at George for what she knew would be the last time. Love occupied his eyes, and so did life. She wanted to remember his face, his last confession of love forever. Slowly, Sherry crept up behind the assailant, while George distracted him, a piece of stone from the street in hand. Under his breath, George said, "For the last time." A loud thump and George was on the floor. The killer stabbed him continuously until a pool of crimson red surrounded his limp body. Sherry took this moment of weakness and admiration to hit the killer over the head as hard as she could muster with the stone. She made a break for her life and somehow made it out alive.